being willing to be interviewed for our short courses on postgraduate supervision.
Welcome.
And I'm going to leap in at the deep end. In the article you wrote for Prospect 2014, you assert that universities tend to over-individualize education and research, particularly in the social sciences. So could you please elaborate on that argument?
Yeah, I do think it's one of the fault lines of nowadays education, that we overly focus on individuals and on individual degrees. And many universities, I would argue, with but only small twinkle in the eye, have become almost degree factories. You know, we are busy as faculty in running processes of getting as much people through courses and degrees, and in this very process the only focus that is left is, you know, does the individual receive at the end of the day the degree? And we lose track of what I believe is that a need to see education in a more collective way, because the burning issues we are facing in today's societies cannot be resolved by individuals. And in turn, many of the theses and research work that we receive are also over-individualized. It's an individual who delivers to a supervisor or two. Some external examiners may be involved, and not many more people usually read what has been written. And I feel we are losing a chance to collectivize this knowledge, or to create also collective processes to generate this knowledge in order to address issues which require this more participatory approach in today's society.
So I'm somewhat mystified, because I'm so used to the processes of a conventional university. How do you collectivize research?
Yeah, well, this is a theme we have given a lot of thought about. On the one hand, I do believe that research, as much as universities institutionally, needs to be more embedded in society as a whole. So very often it is a separate institution which I, as a student, visit for 3, 4, 5 years, and then the university time is over. And we like to talk about lifelong learning, but very often in universities it doesn't go beyond the annual alumni meeting, which is more of a network thing. So we need to carefully think, I believe, about processes in order to stimulate collective research processes. And here's the way how we began to, in our PhD and formerly also master's program, to work with it. The one is that when we form a new PhD cohort, for example, we try to stimulate that people work closely together, because they all go through a similar process, and that there's a strong level of people in a cohort working together. But I have to go even a step back, because our particular program is designed for addressing burning issues in society, and always in the context where a person comes from. So already when a person joins a PhD, I will ask the person, I'm not interested, or tell the person, in an individual joining a program, but I want you to join with your community, with your enterprise, where the burning issue is that you are facing. Because if through the process you ultimately address it, it will only work if that enterprise or community is working with you. So one of the first things any participant will have to do is to develop what we call an innovation ecosystem. So in your own context, you have to find a steward. We have 4 key characters, and there is variations. And the steward would be someone who is hosting your research. It could be a CEO of an enterprise who said, I would like this transformative research to happen. It could be a superintendent of a school in which a researcher, of course we have a case in Jordan now where there is a young social researcher, the superintendent is hosting this research, is interested, participating in it in order to allow change to happen in the organization. So we need this kind of power structure also engaged in the process. The other thing is we need catalysts. Catalysts are people that you bring into your network who catalyze your thinking. They will ask critical questions. They will connect you to people who are relevant for your research, who help you catalyze your thinking, so you are not, as so often, isolated in a library-based research, but you bring these people into your network. And then we think about co-researchers. Who are people who are interested enough in going deeper into your own field, into the literature you are needing, into your writing, to give you feedback on this, to participate in this, and of course, as you know, then our work always moves towards participatory action research methodologies at the end of the process, so for which you need co-researchers who take this journey, research journey, together with you. And then there is a fourth character that you need to find, and often it's not one person but more a person, which we call facilitators, which are people in your context which are known to make things happen. They may not be very academically inclined, but they are interested in innovation, and they would like, or they are able to bring it into practice, because that is needed in order to ultimately work in the field. Now, as an individual joining a program, you may have one or two of these capacities, but usually you do not have all four. And so we encourage that people work with a whole team of about 8 or 10 people who then collectively own the research, while the individual writes and is in the lead, but the group is ultimately owning the research as a whole. Now there is more to say, because there's a whole, as we grew in our own work, we noticed it's very good to get people around you, but you also need to begin from an early stage to think how your own research to innovation, we like this combined term, research to innovation, is always geared towards institutionalization. Because ultimately, if your thesis is not somewhere reflected in new institutional structures, it is likely not to take deep roots. So we have developed something which we call CARE. And our PhD program, for example, is also called Care for Society. And CARE is an acronym for 4 terms. And the C stands for community activation, meaning in this first phase of your PhD, or for the matter a master's program, you would need to activate richly your community around yourself. You sound out what they think about your topic. You see, how does your own vision for change resonate with society? Otherwise, you may be just in your ivory tower. But you activate the field, your network, the school in which you work, or your enterprise or community, to get feedback and to see who are people who potentially want to participate in this journey. And then we come to A, and the A for us is awakening integral consciousness. Having in mind we work with an integral perspective underlying our PhD research, and this is a new kind of paradigmatic language towards a more holistic understanding of systems that many people are not used to engage with. So in the second phase, with a more closer group of people, the ecosystem that I mentioned, you need to also introduce and co-own a new language for change. So you equip the whole group to really accompany you on the journey to make something happen. And then we come to the R, and the R is institutionalized research to innovation. That means you think how in your organization, community, or in your society you can institutionalize a research center around the issue you are working on. It could be a small research center in your own school, or in your enterprise, a research functions which takes this journey institutionally on. So it's not ending after a PhD process comes to an end. And the final one, the E, is embodiment, which on the one hand means you need to embody what you are talking about, what you bring to the world. That is an individual dimension. But the collective one is, how do you embody it through a newly transformative education? So the center you created or that you contributed to is also delivering transformative education. So you have to frame what you have come up with also into a new piece of education. So education and curricula gets continuously renewed and gets not, as we so often witness, static, professors teach the same stuff year after year again, but we want to bring such high-level co-researchers, PhD or masters, into a process of co-creating curricula or the E could stand for transformative enterprise. So how does your own enterprise, your organization, has changed so that it does embody the transformative research you have conducted? Because we always begin with, in our research, what is the burning issue you address? And at the end of the day, you need to illustrate how you yourself, but also your context, is now embodying the solution you have co-developed. So these are a couple of points. And there's more to share, but I can also wait first for some feedback from your side.
Thank you, because I have at least two questions that arise from what you said. The first is, what kind of, I'm coming back to the conventional view of postgraduate supervision. What is the product that is the result of all these processes? Is it still a conventional thesis of, let's say, 300 pages?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, first of all, yes, and it is that as well. For me, admittedly, and I know I'm a bit subversive, the thesis is almost the derivative of the process. It documents what has happened, but almost more important is the whole ambition to create new knowledge and new practice, and that has to be reflected in the thesis.
So is the thesis still, does it still have the same structure of introduction, literature review, research methodology, findings, etc.?
Yeah, it does have a similar structure, but it is also has evolved the structure, and I want to maybe share a little bit about that, because issues like, of course, research question is absolutely fundamental. We call it, in our case, we link it to what is your calling. What calls you to change? What is your drive? And of course, what is the calling of your society, of your organization? Because if it's just your own calling or your own research question, it may not have resonance and relevance for society. So that is a dual thing. We translate research question, if you so want, into what we call calling. And then we come to the next, we have 4 C's, which are aligned with the 4 Ks. So the first is the call. The second one is context. So you go, as we often do in conventional PhDs, you have to have a deep understanding of your context. To do that, you use research methodology. That could be, for example, hermeneutics or phenomenology to get deep understanding of your particular context. But you do it, you may recall, we are now in the second C, it's aligned with the A of care, the ecosystem. So you do that also now together with others, a deep understanding of your context, with a view what are the imbalances in your context, and with a view what are the potentials for change in your context that you can develop. And then we come, so you can see now already, we are using research method and methodology again in a very transformative way. And I continue in a moment the process, but I wanted to make an argument, because we found, and I had the same experience in my PhD 25 years back, that the whole work with research methodology has become a little bit of an alibi. There's a chapter of research methodology, very often plug and paste, not really, no plagiation, but the notion that people do that as an exercise because they have to prove that they have engaged with the methodology, rather than using a methodology for what it usually is, a transformative philosophy that can have the power to effect and accompany social change. So hermeneutics, or in Africa, African hermeneutics, has a power to review hermeneutically a particular context with a view to change it, not just to interpret it, to change. So then we come to the next C, which we call co-creation, because now we have to co-create new theory based on your understanding of context. And here we use, for example, critical theory or feminism or African feminism in order to emancipate ourselves from an existing theory base, because a PhD usually begins with a question because there is a lack somewhere which needs to be addressed, or a burning issue that needs to be addressed in theory and practice. So you come to use critical theory or feminism to develop new theory. But then you don't stop. You move then in the final C, which is for us contribution. There you use action research, and it could be cooperative inquiry, it could be participatory action research, it could be social technical designs. We have 4 different and conventional action research where you have to bring your theory into practice to ultimately, as Levin, the founder of action research, says, social theory which is not in a way also leading to social change is useless. And we share that belief, and in particular in times like ours. So you can see a lot of so-called conventional elements of a PhD thesis coming out in our work as well. So you will see that also in the way how the thesis is structured. But it is, I would argue, more transformatively designed because we are driven to see the PhD as a vehicle, or the master's or a bachelor as a vehicle for social change. So I hope I partly answered your question.
You did. My other question is, in this collaborative process, is there only one supervisor and then the student with this whole constellation of co-researchers?
Yeah, there is, in our case we have 2. There's always 2, and in this particular case, because it's a PhD designed very much by Transform, but in cooperation, as you may know, with the South African-based Da Vinci Institute, which accredits and also very much richly participates in this process. We come later to Mode 2 and Mode 1, because this is a Mode 2 university geared towards knowledge creation in the public space, which actually is also what we do. We, in our case, expanded not just to enterprise work, working with organizations, primarily private enterprise, but with communities as well. So there are 2 supervisors working with us, but I want to say a word about the term supervisor, because it's a bit, I'm uneasy with it. And of course, I'm fully aware it needs this kind of mentoring, supervisory role. And yet, conventional supervision very often is an unhelpful power play in the process of knowledge creation, because often the supervisor is a bottleneck if he or she doesn't cooperate or read or give feedback, things don't move. And we like to see and do our best that people join, in our case, a field of knowledge creation or a knowledge and value creating community where the supervisor is more like the arch catalyst. I'm continuously reviewing, inputting, helping, but almost on a step-by-step base. So we read, I invite participants to send immediately when a chapter or even a draft is written, send it in, so feedback comes as a continuous stream, and that allows me also to then connect people to relevant sources, to relevant people, and to help strengthening this field of co-researchers that I earlier on talked about. Mm-hmm. So yes, there is a supervisor, but a notion or deep sense that the very role of a supervisor has to be very critically also reviewed in most universities, as I see it today.
Could you talk a little bit more about that? I do know that in this university, what I see as the PhD supervisor used to be called the promoter. Maybe you'd be happier with that term, but which term would you choose for the person who fulfills this role, and why?
Yeah, of course, I want to share, that very often I come across students who say, well, I see my bachelor, master's, PhD supervisor every now and then. Or actually, on a bachelor level, you often don't even meet the person. Maybe for a first conversation, and then you hand it in. And I think we are losing a whole potential to really richly enroll young people into a co-creative process. And I want to say why I think this is so important also. Knowledge moves so much faster now than it moved 50, 100 years ago. And the younger generation grows up with such a new understanding also of life, of society, of organization, it in a way carries, often implicitly, not necessarily explicitly, a whole new knowledge creation potential in itself. And I think for that reason it is so important that supervisors in a way review this role into a much more ongoing, and here's my term, co-creating one. I think it's about knowledge co-creation. So knowledge is kept, as it anyway is, not as a dead resource which I look up, but it's an alive field of continuously renewing knowledge. And that is, for example, Pia, and that is something I wanted to mention also. So in our particular case, because we also work on the emergence and development of a whole new body of integral knowledge and practice. So we invite also, and usually attract, people who are keen in this particular field. So I also say, look, when you join, please don't see yourself as someone who is running your PhD and you get occasionally input. That's what you get anyway. I shared how we do supervision. But I would love you. And then please, if that is resonating, join this particular PhD if you want to contribute to this whole field of knowledge, where you are then a co-creator rather than student supervisor. So we are meeting eye to eye, while of course we are fully aware that on certain levels I have an advantage in experience, which I then also richly share. So co-creator is probably the term I would go for now. And if I'm in Africa, I would look for an African term to substitute it.
Well, maybe we could look at finding one. I'm fascinated because what you're explaining is so different from what we know, at this institution anyway. I'm wondering, have you encountered much resistance with this approach to postgraduate research and supervision? Or not at all, because of the nature of where you work?
Yeah, occasionally you do also find participants who wrestle a little bit with that in terms of they would like to have always a very clear indication. So what we usually have, the professor sets the tone and the student follows. For some people is because they have been developed, conditioned in this pattern. That's what they then for a while also expect. So it does often take time, even if from the outset we are clear, and if from the outset people say, I love that, but often it does take also time to emancipate yourself into this particular space. And the other thing is we really do take our students as co-creators as serious as possible, meaning we really invite them to go deep also in their particular cultural spaces. So for example, and because we work there for so many years, we also have something to contribute to tap in the particular knowledge field that Jordan or the Arab world has to offer. Now if you go into conventional curricula in the Arab world, they draw it from the West. And they pretty much feel they have not much to offer because they imitate, as Africa probably did for a long time, the West, because what kind of knowledge do we have here? And we totally oppress or neglect the rich vein of knowledge that is embedded in this part of the world, in its own indigenous sources, but they are often not seen as equally important or relevant as so-called Western European American sources. And I think this is absolutely dramatic. So where we also find occasionally resistance, that you say then you help a student to tap into its, say for example, Jordanian Arab knowledge world, but then the person itself, though initially passionate, well that's cool, it's my own context that I can really work with, finds a bit intimidated because, well, what do we have to bring? And it is a little bit, that is also a level of implicit resistance that we occasionally find, and yet we find it is so incredibly important to bring that up, because I don't believe we can root social innovation in societies if it's not sufficiently entering their own knowledge and cultural field, which is, alive, or maybe not so alive, but has to be enlivened in such societies. So that is certainly also an aspect where we feel sometimes a bit of resistance on an individual level. On a collective level, I think people sometimes don't believe that we can do as much as we achieve, because we really richly activate the collective field. And when then, like for example, in the Zimbabwean case, combined, two people work together, first in their masters, which we accompanied, then in their PhD, and it led to a community, to a public-private community constellation that brought food security for 300,000 people, 2 PhDs. Of course, with the whole add-on entourage that I earlier on now shared. The whole community was engaged and involved, and that led to something fundamentally significant for, in this case, it was rural Zimbabwe. And people sometimes think, PhD? Because our conventional understanding of a PhD isn't geared towards that this can be an engine for transformation in society, or for the master's and bachelor even less. And that is a kind of doubtful resistance we sometimes feel when we share our stories.
Can I ask a follow-up question? I'm wondering what the implications of this approach to research are in terms of examination of research, and also dissemination of research, and research publications.
Well, we do have our own strict guidelines as well. So, I mean, when it comes to handing in your thesis, which goes through external examination, that is one thing, but it of course goes through an academic viva. And all of these processes are taken very serious, because we need, in particular, if you do something new, you really have to be, you have to show that you get the fundamentals right, while you are of course also stretching and evolving the existing convention. That is also important. So it's a delicate balance. Now the other thing is, we have 2 vivas after a PhD. The one is the academic viva, as we know it. The other one is, and we call it a small PhD and a big PhD. It's not a judgment, but the small is the academic viva. P, small h, capital D, PhD, a Doctor of Philosophy. The big PhD we call a process for holistic development. That is exactly combined with the other one. Now the big viva is held in and with the community to which this social innovation is supposed to contribute. So while, say, the individual participant is then going to present, the community and the ecosystem is also going to present, and the community is going to evaluate whether it has really led to a contribution to a burning issue that the community or the enterprise has perceived. So there is this kind of where we feel actually society, not just an academic gremium, should be invited to mirror and to evaluate whether that work on behalf of society has really contributed to it. So we are experimenting with this very actively, and it's usually an incredibly powerful experience to see then the community not only mirroring back and evaluating, but also in terms of sustainability, owning it. They said, this is now something we are going to keep. This center that has been created, we are now filling it with, and you feel then here something can grow into the future, and we don't stop with the viva.
Mm-hmm. So what about the students who are not successful? How have you managed that, or has it happened at all where a project has failed to engage the community, failed to have the desired outcome?
Well, we have, interesting enough, a very low dropout rate. Mm-hmm. There are a couple of reasons for that. A, we are very small and they're very personal programs. Well, it's small and yet big, so the leverages we create. But in a way, we are now at the moment, we have 20 on our program, which is anyway, it's not too small, but it's not huge. So through the very processes we described and the selection criteria, in the beginning, and we are very outspoken. So if a person doesn't have that calling, that drive to really be part of a community of social transformation, then we invite the person to rather choose one of the thousands of other PhD programs. So that's one thing. The other thing is we have very close relationships. And I want to say something about that, because for me, so that it's not misunderstood. I believe if you enter social change processes and you have a vision what you want to bring to society, you are bound to transform fundamentally yourself. And the issues we are carrying today and addressing the issues is an uphill struggle. It's something where a person usually has a will to go also through a deep personal change. You don't deal with a PhD, which we just now had, on intimate partner violence, if you hadn't been affected by that or witnesses, and in the same process emancipate yourself as you want to bring emancipation to victims of such processes. So you need to be, as a supervisor, we need to be very available to these inner processes as well. And usually that creates also a very strong ties that we do develop, and not in an abusive way, obviously, and that is to always have the necessary also professional distance, and yet also to know from the very beginning that these processes require also an involvement on the personal level. So we have relatively few people who ultimately drop out. It happens occasionally in the beginning, in particular because people, and this is one issue I would even like to address, when they find they cannot bring it together, work takes on because it's a part-time PhD and I can't give enough attention to the process, and then they drop out after some time. That does happen occasionally. And here's something that I would like to add here, because we are trying our best, and I believe that's really something which is very important to develop further, is that these processes, in particular when they are linked to social change, are designed so that they fit into the work I'm doing. So in a way, the burning issue I'm addressing needs to be part of my context and not somewhere in a country where I not even have been. I always begin with the context in which I am, so that what you do doesn't make you doesn't make your plate even fuller than it already is, but it kind of enriches it, substantiates it. It can be aligned with the work you are anyway doing. And I think this is an incredibly important, ingredient for the, well, I don't like so much the term success rate, but if I want to use it now, for the success rate we usually have, that we try to design it that it's really aligned with the burning issue that your context faces. And the more you can do it, your context also wants to cooperate, participate, and then it's not anymore, well, how do I bring that together with family and work, and here's my PhD. That is a very difficult journey to take. So we have actually often people who finish within 2.5, 3 years, because it's, then the momentum builds up, and then it really, we conclude also relatively soon. Have in mind, we never conclude. No? It's really then the life journey that people take on, and then the center usually has been built, and people then move on. Not out, but they move on that journey.
Mm-hmm. So this is all very inspiring. And I'm wondering, because we need to end off soon, and there's so many more questions and so much more clearly you can say, but what would you, for colleagues at this institution who might like to initiate something similar here, what advice would you give?
I want to first say and also honor the enormous institutional and systemic constraints that most academics find. So you find a lot of people who want to do great things, and it's incredibly difficult. So, on the one hand, I do think, however, that we need to find ways to evolve the institutional structure of a university. That's one thing. And of course, this is a big term because every university is already on that journey to some degree or not, but I say that as a generic statement. The other thing is, to the degree that we can create such programs so that the field that is constituted and people work in their communities, in their enterprises, is also including the university. So in a way, the renewal process is not all on the shoulders of the academic faculty staff, but the way how we design processes on the bachelor, master's and PhD level is also designed to feed back into the renewal of the university. I think that is an incredibly important dimension in terms of renewing the university from within. And the other thing is, I feel maybe to explore even more, to the degree that it doesn't happen already, to work in the interface between university, community, enterprise, and such institutions like, for example, ours. Because our Transform Center for Integral Development, based in Geneva, we are not accrediting the program. This we can't. We don't have that accrediting power. But we work together with innovative universities, such as, for example, Da Vinci, who says, well, this is something highly innovative that is very much aligned with where we want to go, and in this interface between the two institutions, that new process can happen. Because often innovation happens in the trans, in the interface. It's very difficult to bring it into the heart of an institution straight away. It usually happens in the fringe, and then it can gradually renew the center. So I think this interface and finding organizations who are on that journey and want to work together in this renewal process can be very helpful in that journey.